You have surely seen this weapon from the Second World War, the iconic MP40, but how much do you truly know about the turbulent story behind it? And why American soldiers came to despise it so deeply? Today, we step back through time to uncover exactly that. To understand how the MP40 emerged, we must return to the very origins of German submachine guns. At the dawn of the 20th century, armies placed their faith in long-range surplus bolt-action rifles. Power, precision, and distance defined military thinking. But during the First World War, a new idea took shape, the submachine gun, and it stood in stark contrast to everything that had come before. Why? Because the rise of water-cooled machine guns and rapid-firing artillery shattered the old model of mobile warfare. Infantry and cavalry charges collapsed into a static, brutal stalemate of trenches, unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. For the first time, aircraft offered reconnaissance and real-time intelligence, making it nearly impossible for either side to outmaneuver the other. Trenches spread relentlessly, line against line, with no breakthrough in sight. The warring armies pounded one another with relentless artillery and repelled wave after wave of costly assaults. With no solution emerging, commanders shifted their focus. Instead of massed charges, small raiding parties crept across no man's land under the cover of darkness, slipping into enemy trenches. But in those narrow, suffocating passages, the standard 1-meter-long, 5-shot rifles, accurate out to 1,000 meters, became almost useless. The heavy water-cooled Maxim guns offered no help either. Pistols and revolvers lacked the firepower needed to survive the savage, close-quarters struggle. Every nation sought a weapon suited to this brutal environment. The Americans fielded their infamous trench shotgun, while the Germans pioneered one of the first reliable submachine guns for their elite stormtroopers. The term submachine gun itself was later used to distinguish these compact weapons from the larger machine guns, a name popularized by the marketing of the American Thompson, crafted to sound modern and innovative. But back in Germany's early experiments, engineers began by converting existing pistols to full auto fire. These improvised designs, however, proved far too light and far too uncontrollable to be effective. Theodor Bergmann's firm, together with designer Hugo Schmeisser, introduced the world's first truly practical submachine gun, the Maschinenpistole 18, or simply the MP18. Unveiled in 1918 as a dedicated trench sweeper. Armed with a 32-round drum magazine and firing a 9mm pistol cartridge at 350 to 500 rounds per minute, it offered far greater utility in the tight, chaotic confines of trench warfare than anything before it. Its debut came during the German Spring Offensive of 1918, when elite stormtrooper units shattered the silence of the trenches with sudden bursts of walking fire, sweeping through Allied positions in brutal close-quarters combat. Though the offensive ultimately failed, and fewer than 30,000 MP-18s were ever produced, the weapon left a profound impression in the final months of the war. Other nations quickly realized what a compact, fast-firing pistol-caliber weapon could accomplish. Soon, nearly every submachine gun created up to the end of the Second World War bore some trace of Schmeisser's design. The Italians introduced the peculiar Villar Perosa, essentially two machine pistols fused together, while the Americans fielded the iconic .45 ACP Thompson. And although the armistice brought the First World War to an end, it did not halt German innovation. Quietly preparing for the next conflict, they continued refining their designs despite the Treaty of Versailles. The MP28 emerged with a simpler straight-box magazine, and the concept evolved further as its value became undeniable. Observing the Spanish Civil War, a proving ground where German advisors tested new tactics and weapons, they again witnessed the effectiveness of submachine guns in brutal street fighting. Even with the next war expected to be more mobile and less reliant on trenches, the Wehrmacht recognized these weapons would remain indispensable. In 1938, a new requirement was issued, and designer Heinrich Vollmer responded with the MP38, crafted specifically for the Wehrmacht. Unlike earlier wooden-stocked weapons, this one looked almost futuristic, No wood, a fully folding stock, and a compact profile ideal for close quarters work or the cramped interiors of armored vehicles. Its receiver was machined steel, while the foregrip and pistol grip were formed from bakelite, an early plastic that, despite its sleek appearance, created problems. After sustained fire, these materials conducted heat far more than wood, and soldiers soon learned, often painfully, why gloves became essential after just a few magazines. A rare variant, the MP41, retained a traditional wooden stock. Vollmer also placed the charging handle on the left side, allowing soldiers to keep their firing hand steady on the trigger while reloading or clearing a malfunction. Operating on a simple open-bolt blowback system and chambered in the familiar 9mm Parabellum, the MP38 delivered a steady 500 rounds per minute, a new chapter in Germany's evolving family of submachine guns. Essentially, it was the same MP18 concept, simply modernized for a new kind of war. The MP38 was adopted by the German army almost immediately, yet only a small number entered combat when Germany invaded Poland. Just 8,000 were available across the entire force, as production had only begun to accelerate. Still, in the fast, mechanized chaos of Blitzkrieg, the weapon quickly proved its value. With that, the Germans demanded a version that could be produced on a massive scale, cheaper, simpler, but no less effective. This necessity gave rise to the legendary MP40. Its core design remained nearly identical, but every element was optimized for industrial speed. Expensive machined components were replaced with stamped sheet metal parts and spot welds wherever possible. Production soared, though not without early problems. Rushed manufacturing introduced flaws. Troops reported frequent jams in the first batches, a predictable result of hurried mass production. Later models corrected most of these issues. Another dangerous flaw carried over from the MP38 was its tendency to fire accidentally. Without a proper safety, a jolt or a drop could send a round unexpectedly into the air, a terrifying thought in close company. The MP40 addressed this with a dual-slot safety notch, locking the bolt securely either open or closed and removing the risk of unintended discharge. Mechanically, the MP40 remained very close to its predecessor, still feeding from the familiar double-stack 32-round magazine. Interestingly, the magazine's design was patented by Hugo Schmeisser, despite his limited involvement in the MP38 or MP40 themselves. His name, stamped prominently on the magazine, soon led soldiers to nickname the weapon the Schmeisser. By now, German factories were turning out MP40s as fast as they could, each costing 57 Reichsmarks, roughly 1,200 modern US dollars. Not inexpensive, yet over 1 million were ultimately produced, making it the second most common German automatic weapon of the war after the MG34. For comparison, over 14 million Kar 98K rifles were manufactured, dwarfing every other German firearm. And still, despite its cost, the MP40 was far cheaper than the American Thompson, which in today's value exceeded $2,000 per unit. This drove the United States to adopt the M3 grease gun, borrowing certain MP40 features and simplifying the design until it could be built for the equivalent of just $300. The British followed a similar path with the Sten, which could be produced for even less, comparable to the Soviet PPSH. But we will examine those comparisons more closely later, particularly when we explore why the MP40 gained such a notorious reputation among American troops. It is important to remember that the MP40 was never meant to replace the infantry rifle. It was a specialist's weapon. Early in the war, ordinary soldiers rarely carried one. It was reserved for squad leaders, assault detachments, and tank crews. German infantry doctrine centered on the machine gun, either the MG34 or the MG42, operated by a 3-man team consisting of the gunner, his assistant, and an ammunition bearer. These men formed the squad's true striking power, while the MP40 served a more focused, tactical role. Another 6 soldiers carried Kar 98K rifles to shield the machine gun team, while a single officer led the squad, the only man typically issued an MP40. He carried 6 magazines in dedicated pouches, along with a loading tool and a pistol as his sidearm. Paratroopers were among the earliest to adopt the MP40, and panzer crews followed soon after, since a full-length rifle was nearly useless inside the cramped interiors of armored vehicles. But everything changed when Germany collided with the Soviet Red Army on the Eastern Front. In the ruined, smoke-choked cities, places like Stalingrad, where combat took place at point-blank range among shattered walls, the Germans rediscovered the brutal necessity of the submachine gun. Worse still, they found themselves facing Soviet units armed with PPSH-41s. Crude by comparison, built quickly and cheaply, these weapons nevertheless outmatched the refined German MP40 and were produced in overwhelming numbers, roughly 6-to-1. In such battles, submachine guns were king, and when German forces could not field enough MP40s, they resorted to capturing Soviet PPSHs. Soon they went even further, converting thousands of them to fire 9mm instead of 7.62 Tokarev, modifying the guns to accept MP40 magazines. Approximately 10,000 were rebuilt this way. Even more remarkable, unmodified PPSHs could still operate using German-made 7.63 Mauser pistol ammunition, allowing frontline troops to keep captured guns supplied without any conversion at all. By mid-war, the Soviet PPSH had become the second most common submachine gun in German hands, used widely, and ironically, against the very nation that designed it. So how did these two weapons truly compare? The PPSH-41, chambered in 7.62 Tokarev, could fire an astonishing 1,200 rounds per minute. Its smaller, faster cartridge delivered better penetration and longer effective range than the slower, heavier 9mm Parabellum, though the 9mm offered greater stopping power. But it was the PPSH's sheer rate of fire and near unbreakable simplicity that made it so devastating. In close quarters fighting, a soldier could rush into a room and empty a full magazine in under 2 seconds, sweeping the space with bullets before anyone had time to react. The MP40, with its much lower rate of fire, simply could not match that ferocity. Yet it had its strengths: far better control, steadier accuracy, and the ability to hold a target through an entire magazine. It also conserved ammunition more effectively. But in the brutal chaos of urban combat, high cyclic rate and mechanical reliability often mattered more than precision. Unloaded, the MP40 weighed about 4 kilograms, heavy for a submachine gun, but that weight helped tame recoil. Its practical range reached only about 100 meters, limited by its pistol cartridge. Over prolonged use, the folding stock developed a tendency to wobble, making any thought of long-range precision hopeless. German engineers even attempted an experimental solution, the MP40/1, designed to hold 2 magazines side by side to reduce reload times, intended as an answer to the Soviet 71-round drums. Only a few hundred were built. The idea proved too cumbersome. In the field, soldiers resorted to their own simpler method, taping 2 magazines together, jungle style, to speed up the next reload, a small adaptation born from harsh necessity. However, the real weakness of the MP40 was its magazine and feed system. You see, the magazine was a double-column but single-feed design. This means that rounds are stored side by side, and then the column narrows to 1 stack at the very end of the magazine. So only 1 round is going to be loaded at a time. The American Thompson, for example, used a double feed type where rounds were loaded from both sides and were stored not directly beside one another, but slightly offset. This was a much more reliable solution because in the MP40's case, its MP18-based design-thin steel magazines and the unclean conditions of the battlefield with mud and dust could easily cause misfeeds and jam the gun. Soldiers quickly learned to oil their magazines and keep them clean. If they wanted them to work during battle, less experienced soldiers would hold the gun directly by the magazine instead of the small grip built for this. So the magazine could bend and jam the rounds inside. It is even written in the German manual that you should not hold the MP40 by the magazine. And soldiers in the field preferred not to load all 32 rounds, but a couple less so the spring wouldn't be compressed all the way back and risk causing problems with feeding. Also, these magazines were much more difficult to load. The Germans issued a magazine loading tool with each MP40 kit to help with this. It is a simple device that goes over the top of the magazine and presses the rounds inside without the soldier bruising his thumbs after loading 6 magazines. However, the gun itself performed quite reliably, even in heavy conditions like the African desert and the Eastern Front, due to its simple direct blowback operating system. But the magazines caused quite a few headaches throughout the war. Allied troops generally avoided using the MP40 in combat, and it was actually strictly forbidden to do so. In a couple of instances, you see the MP40 had a really distinctive sound when firing and when Allied soldiers used captured ones. It created even more confusion on the battlefield and led to quite a few blue-on-blue incident. It is recorded that during the U.S. Ranger assault at Point du Hoc on D-Day, some of them picked up MP40s from Germans they had killed and used them. It was later reported that 4 Rangers were killed by friendly fire lying dead beside the German weapons. So soldiers quickly learned the dangers that came with it and avoided using captured enemy weapons if they didn't really have to. Also, American soldiers preferred the better stopping power of the .45 ACP cartridge used in their Thompsons and M3 grease guns over the 9mm. Even though it had a slightly shorter effective range, the M3 was literally nothing more than a grease gun that could fire, which tells you how simply and crudely it was made. Unlike the fancy German ergonomics, it didn't even have a charging handle. You had to stick your finger into a cutout on the bolt. The safety was just a simple latch, and the stock was made of bent wire. The British Sten was even cheaper than the M3, and it was also chambered in 9mm, like the MP40. While the Germans still centered their main infantry weapon around full-power rifles, they also realized the advantages of higher capacity and faster firing weapons like submachine guns. But they struggled with range, which is why they started looking for an intermediate cartridge. They wanted a round that sat between the overkill of full-power rifles and the underperformance of pistol cartridges. Something in the sweet spot of where most fighting actually took place in World War II. This was mostly under 300 meters. That led them to the IRV, or what we know today as the assault rifle with its 7.92 by 33mm cartridge. The STG-44 was the first real example of that idea. It had a much higher capacity than standard rifles with its 30-round magazine offered full auto capability for close quarters and still stayed effective out to around 400 meters, far more than any submachine gun could reach. In 1944, the Sturmgewehr replaced the MP40 in both production and doctrine. The war ended before the Germans could perfect the idea of a universal assault rifle, but they still produced over 400,000 of them and showed the world a concept that would inspire generations of weapons. And doesn't it look suspiciously like the AK-47, which later became the most produced assault rifle on Earth?